Oh, okay. I serve Italia. We're often told that Dante's Commedia starts in medias res, halfway through our life's journey. I'm going to emulate this technique by starting tonight's lecture right in the middle of the three cantos that I've undertaken to discuss, by quoting the central line. It's line 76 of 152, so literally the central line of Canto 6 of Purgatorio. I serve Italia. This, well, what is it? A sigh of despair, an angry exclamation, a groan of frustration. This outburst, it seems to me, serves as the natural and necessary starting point for our exploration of the sixth cantos of Inferno, Purgatorio and Paradiso. Not only because of the way in which it seems to sum up all the poet's despair, anger and frustration at the parlous state of the world in which he lives, but also, and more importantly, because of the voice in which it's pronounced, which distinguishes it from the text that surrounds it, and from the narrative of the other cantos under consideration here tonight, giving it a particular and broader significance. I serve Italia. Let me put this exclamation into context for you. Wandering on the lower slopes of Mount Purgatory, still unsure of the best route by which to ascend, Dante's pilgrim and his guide Virgil come across a lone soul. His solitude is important, but I shall return to that in a moment. A lone soul who ignores their request for help in finding their way up the mountain, and instead questions them about their provenance. This soul is Sordello, a poet and notorious womanizer who'd been born near Mantua in the early years of the 13th century and had died in exile in Provence around 1269. No sooner does Virgil begin to answer Sordello's question by naming his own hometown, Mantua, than the soul leaps to his feet and embraces him, exclaiming, "O Mantuano, io son Sordello della tua terra." And it's at this point that the invective beginning I serve Italia breaks into the narrative of Dante's story, with the same sudden and unexpected burst of energy as that which propels Sordello out of his solitude and into the arms of Virgil. I've said that this invective breaks into the narrative, and this can be seen, if I'm allowed to trespass just for a moment on my neighbour's canto, it can be seen in the fact that the embrace described in line 75 of Canto 6 is still going on and being reiterated in the opening lines of Canto 7. In fact, the final 76 lines of Purgatorio 6 represent a kind of freeze-frame moment when time stands still and the clock only starts ticking again with this transition into the next canto. These lines then do not form part of the story of Dante Pilgrim's journey through Purgatory, but in a sense hang over it in its entirety, like a gloss not only on the moment of Virgil and Sordello's embrace, but on the whole journey, seen in relation to the world that the protagonist has left behind. It's for this reason that these lines seem to me like as good a place as any to begin what seemed, when I first began to look at them in detail, like the impossible task of analysing these three amazingly ambitious and wide-ranging sixth cantos. By reading the invective forwards, backwards, and, as it were, sideways, that is, in terms of how it anticipates Paradiso 6, recalls Inferno 6, and functions in its immediate context of Purgatorio 6, I hope to open up something of the significance of these cantos, while acknowledging from the outset that in the time available here tonight, I shall scarcely be able to scratch the surface of all that they contain, and our workshop just before this lecture just made me all the more aware of the many, many things that I'm not going to mention, so I hope you'll be forgiving of all the things that I could have said but won't. I serve Italia, then. And already we must pause, because to the reader newly emerged from the pages of the Inferno, The very scale of the poet's attack here must come as something of a surprise. During the course of the Inferno, contemporary Italy has been criticised on many occasions, but always, as it is in Inferno 6, at the level of the individual city-state, whether the Florence evoked by Ciacco in the canto that we'll be talking about tonight, or by Farinata or by Brunetto, or the Lucca of the corrupt politicians, the Pisa evoked by Ugolino, or the wicked Genoa, whose citizens, some of them at least, are mere human shells, their souls already in hell. But here, the object of the attack is the whole Italian peninsula, in which there's not one part, as the poet points out here, which enjoys peace. Non stanno senza guerra li vivi tuoi. The whole of Italy is at war. It's important to clarify immediately, I think, that the address to Italia here does not mean for a moment that Dante conceives of the Italian peninsula as a single political entity. However he might have been read during the Risorgimento, Dante is very clear, as here, for example, in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, that Italy is a geographical reality for him, but not a political one. In this passage, he insists that if Italy had a royal court, which it doesn't, this would be the natural home of that illustrious vernacular that his treatise on language is trying to define, but that in the absence of any such unifying political structure, the illustrious vernacular finds itself homeless and needs to be invented, drawing on the various local dialects present in the peninsula. In Purgatorio 6, Dante's argument is a political one rather than a linguistic one, but the same principle holds true. Serva Italia, as Dante uses it here, is, I think, a collective noun, referring to a geographically contiguous set of communes, republics, and kingdoms, united only by their egregious lack of unity. The dividedness of contemporary Italy is evoked by Dante in the invective through the striking image of citizens of the same city, those enclosed by the same walls and moat, literally at one another's throats. This image cannot but evoke Ugolino and Ruggeri, two citizens of the same earthly city, who in hell are locked together eternally in icy Cocytus, the former gnawing on the brains of the latter. But beyond this, it also recalls the way in which, in the parallel canto of the Inferno, canto 6 that is, the pilgrim describes his own city of Florence as a città partita, a divided city, against the backdrop of the triple-jawed gnawing of Cerberus. The sin of gluttony being punished here is not, of course, specifically a political one. And yet the parallel between the glutton's disordered relationship with food and the disordered political situation of contemporary Florence is made clear in Ciacco's comparison of the city to an overfilled stomach, piena di invidia, sì che già trabocca il sacco. This image of political greed strongly recalls the way in which Dante had described the political order and its inevitable tendency to descend into corruption in Book 4 of his Convivio. Here, he repeats the Aristotelian assertion that human beings are naturally political animals, compagnevoli animali, designed to live with and for their fellows in a community. Given their human insufficiencies, Dante goes on, human beings cannot achieve their ultimate goal, happiness, la vita felice, except with the help of their fellows within the community. And so, in pursuit of this goal of happiness, they tend to come together in typical groupings or communities, the household or family, the vicinanza or group of families sworn to protect and support one another, the city or the kingdom. So far, so Aristotelian. But as this passage goes on, a darker conception of the human political order begins to emerge, one in which the human desire for ever more goods, what Dante calls the gloria d'acquistare, inevitably brings conflict and disorder into the world. This political pessimism owes more to St. Augustine than to Aristotle, taking up the Augustinian view of post-lapsarian humanity as being inevitably characterized by cupiditas, meaning not just greed. It's often translated as greed, but it means not just greed for possessions, but any kind of immoderate desire or ambition. So characterized by cupiditas and by the lust for power and desire of domination over others, or libido dominandi. For Augustine, this desire to dominate others has its root in the sin of pride, which lies at the basis of the sin of Lucifer and that of Adam and Eve. It's the desire to work for the good of the individual at the expense of the common good of the community. And in this, it strikes at the heart of the naturally political aspect of human nature. For Augustine, then, political structures do not develop in order to help support the common human search for happiness, but in order to maintain at least a semblance of peace and order among human beings who want only to lord it over those who should be their equals in their families, cities, and kingdoms. The echoes of this Augustinian pessimism in Convivio 4 are very clear. But it's evident from the pilgrim's exchange with Ciacco that cupiditas and the libido dominandi, even if they're not given those precise names, also reign in contemporary Florence, as they do too in contemporary Siena in Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of bad government, dating from soon after Dante's death, where tyranny is shown flanked by the figures of pride, avarice and vainglory. In a similar vein, according to Ciacco, superbia, invidia e avarizia sono le tre faville che hanno I cuori accesi. It's pride, as we've seen, that leads political animals to desire to dominate one another, while greed and envy lie at the root of that human inability to be content with what we have, which Dante describes so eloquently in the Convivio. Moreover, if the effect of these besetting political sins is to undermine the communal spirit and to set the good of the individual over and above the good of the community, then Dante's depiction of the character of Sordello in Purgatorio 6 comes to take on a particular significance. Almost uniquely in the Commedia, Sordello is un'anima sola soletta, a soul all alone, one who appears not to be associated with any group or community of fellow souls. Critics have variously attempted to associate Sordello both with the souls who died a violent death described in Canto 5 and with the negligent rulers to whom Sordello himself will introduce us in Canto 7. But Sordello cannot be plausibly assimilated with the princes in the valley, since he was certainly not a ruler nor even a politician, really. And although it's not impossible, as some have suggested, that Dante may have possessed information about Sordello which has since been lost to us, information that is confirming that he died violently, there is no hint of anything of the sort in the two extant Occitan biographies of Sordello, and there is significantly nothing else in Dante's presentation of him that cannot be gleaned either from his poems or from these Vidas. We're left then to draw the conclusion that Sordello really is that most unusual thing in Dante's text, a soul in the singular, one with no crowd behind him. All the more surprising, then, is the rapturous welcome that this lonely and somewhat standoffish, his altera e disdegnosa, that this standoffish soul gives to Virgil, without knowing his identity, which is not revealed until the following canto. But sol per lo dolce suon della sua terra. His sudden breaking out of his self-absorption, his tutta in sé romita, as he rises up to embrace Virgil, is anticipated, I think, in Inferno 6, at the moment when Ciacco recognizes the passing pilgrim. Here, Ciacco leaves the customary position of the sinners in this circle, face down in the stinking mud, in order to greet the pilgrim, suddenly sitting up and crying out in recognition, as Sordello does, when he hears the name of his hometown. But whereas Virgil enthusiastically returns the embrace of this unknown Mantuan, Dante's pilgrim, although he had known Chaco in life, we later find, he keeps him here somewhat at arm's length, failing to recognise him either as a fellow citizen or as an individual, almost as if to protect himself from the taint of those sins which pit Florentine against Florentine to create the antithesis of community. No such qualms restrain the souls in purgatory, who, not only in this canto but throughout the Cantica, embrace and support one another, praying and working together towards salvation. But this general rule renders Sordello's solitude all the more problematic and casts his embrace of Virgil in a slightly more nuanced light. We've seen that Sordello is unusually a soul without a community, and we've also seen that in life he was, like Dante himself, an exile. But unlike Dante, who defines himself in his letters as Florentinus et exul in meritus, a Florentine undeservedly in exile, unlike Romeo, who appears at the end of Paradiso 6, Sordello's exile is self-imposed. It's a consequence of his less than courtly activities with the wives and sisters of his hosts, which force him to keep moving for his own safety. And where Dante continues, even in exile, to define himself as a Florentine, Sordello's rejection of his city is absolute. For the De Vulgari Eloquentia tells us that Sordello, in his flight from Mantua, also abandoned his local language in favour of his adoptive vernacular of Occitan. In life, then, Sordello was far from being an example of perfect Mantuan citizenship. And given this, his embrace of Virgil begins to look as if it has something of the purgatorial about it. If the purpose of purgatory is to right the wrongs committed in life, washing away the stain of earthly sins, then the enthusiastic welcome that Sordello extends to Virgil at the mere sound of his city's name almost reads like an act of penance, a spontaneous expression of caritas, which opposes the cupiditas which he'd allowed to taint all his earthly relationships with his friends and benefactors, with his city, and even with his native tongue. Even if in Sordello's case the gloria d'acquistare, this insatiable desire for more and more, had been more about women than about land or other possessions, his life nonetheless illustrates that same lesson which Dante presents us with in the Convivio, where human weakness undermines community and makes of every individual an anima sola soletta. The Convivio does not, however, draw the Augustinian conclusion towards which it appears to be moving, that given the sinful nature of humanity, political states are little better than bands of robbers. Rather, the Convivio's solution to the discord that afflicts individuals, families, cities, and kingdoms, as you can see in the passage which immediately follows that which I quoted previously, is to destroy both cupiditas and the libido dominandi on earth by placing all possessions and all power in the hands of a single individual, uno principe, who, tutto possedendo e più desiderare non possendo, is immune to cupiditas, since he could not possibly want more than what he already has, and is thus able to hold all the smaller political entities under him, kingdoms and cities and factions and families, in the peace and harmony that will allow them to fulfill their Aristotelian longing for la vita felice. That no such prince exists to bring happiness to the Italy of 1300 should be evident from the opening lines of the A Serva Italia invective, where Dante makes clear, as we've seen, that the political peace which the Convivio imagines being brought about under the rule of such a universal emperor is entirely lacking. But in case the absence of peace were not proof enough of Italy's failure to realise Dante's political ideal, the poet goes on to state explicitly that la sella è vuota, Italy's horse is riderless. And this is all the more shameful in the poet's eyes, because this horse is already, as it were, fully tacked up and ready to be set on the right path towards political harmony. And of course, the mention of Justinian by name here propels us forward to the heaven of Mercury and Paradiso 6, where the speaker, the canto's only speaker in fact, is Justinian himself. In this later canto, Justinian himself glosses Dante's statement that he had been responsible for putting the bit and bridle onto the Italian horse, when he introduces himself as both Cesare and Giustiniano, and explains that dentro le leggi trassi il troppo e il vano. Emperor from 527 to 565 AD, Justinian's greatest achievement for Dante was his codification and simplification of Roman law, weeding out, as he says here, the excessive and the unnecessary, and, in theory at least, giving the Middle Ages a legal framework that was relevant and workable in their new Christian context. Or rather, that would be, were there an emperor to apply it. The lack of any such figure in the Italy of 1300 is the central lament of the Purgatorio's invective, where the poet's fury is turned primarily onto the so-called emperor of the time, Albert of Habsburg, referred to here scathingly as German Albert, Alberto Tedesco. In order to grasp the force with which Dante wields this adjective, the epithet needs to be read in the context of the passage in the Convivio, where Dante explains the raison d'etre of the very concept of empire. The empire, that is only properly imperial, can only fulfill the role for which it was ordained if it is truly universal, for only then can it overcome the power of cupiditas. Albert's Germanness is a sign then of his signal failure to grasp the importance of his role's purpose, not only for his own people, but for all people, everywhere. And it's no coincidence that in line 104, Dante accuses both him and his father Rudolf of cupidigia, for their narrowness of focus is a product of their cupiditas, their self-interest, and the very opposite of the disinterested world rule which the earlier work envisions. Which is not to say, of course, that Albert and Rudolf are unique among emperors in not having embodied the kind of universal remit that the Convivio posits as essential for world peace. Not even the great Justinian, in fact, had ruled over such an empire, as the opening lines of Paradiso 6 make clear. For Justinian had ruled the empire not from what was for Dante its rightful place and divinely predestined seat, but from Constantinople, where the empire's capital had been transferred from Rome in 330 AD by Constantine, moving it significantly, I think, in the wrong direction, from west to east, against the movement of the sun, and against the direction in which Aeneas had originally travelled from Troy to Rome in order to found it. For all his talk of governing the world, then, and without undermining his exceptional importance and influence, Dante makes it clear that Justinian rules from a far-flung corner of the empire, rather than from its centre in Rome. His empire may not be perfect, but in stark contrast to the parochial ambitions of German Albert, he at least strives to make it so, battling throughout his tenure to reconquer the lands in the western half of the empire, recently lost to the Ostrogoths. The mention of Constantine in the very first line of Paradiso 6 cannot but remind the reader of Dante's impassioned invective against the donation of Constantine in Inferno 19, where he laments the papacy's acquisition thereby of wealth and power, the dowry, he calls it here, the dowry that Constantine bestowed on il primo ricco patre, the first rich pope. With the acquisition of wealth and power, as we've already seen, inevitably comes the desire for more wealth and more power, the corrupting influence of cupiditas and the libido dominandi, tainting the church with the same political ills that afflict the secular world. This much is clear in the invective of Purgatorio 6, where the church is even seen as going against God's will in occupying what should be the rightful seat of the emperor. By referring to these churchmen as gente che dovresti essere devoti, you who ought to be devout, but it is implied are not, Dante underlines the damaging effects of religious interference in secular affairs. In his insistence here on the separation of secular and religious power, Dante seems to be preparing for the image that he will use just 10 cantos further on in the Purgatorio of Rome's two suns, two lights of equal brightness, but not one dependent on the other, but with distinct remits. And even more strikingly, he seems to be anticipating the conclusion of the Monarchia, which I've given you here, or part of which I've given you here, where he describes the two ends for which human life is ordered, happiness in this life and happiness in the next, and the two guides, Emperor and Pope, provided by God to lead humanity to these ends, along distinct, separate, but complementary paths. Notice that here too, it's the Augustinian vice of cupiditas that tends to lead human beings off these right paths. And notice too the repetition from Purgatorio 6 of the image of the horse, which needs to be held in check by the bit and bridle of secular and religious guidance. It's likely that the Monarchia was written at roughly the same time as the Paradiso, so it's perhaps unsurprising that Justinian too draws attention to the way in which church and empire can work together for the good of a single human being and of a whole community. Justinian tells the pilgrim that he had originally been a follower of the Monophysite heresy, which denied the dual nature of Christ, and specifically his human nature, thinking of him as wholly divine. And he explains that it was only once his thinking had been corrected by the Sommo Pastore, Pope Agapetus I, that he was able to set to work on his great legal project that would be the new bridle on the horse of state. It's been pointed out that Dante plays quite significantly with chronology here, for Agapetus is known to have visited Constantinople only after Justinian's reordering of Roman law was complete. What's important to Dante, however, I think, is to show the emperor submitting to the authority of the Pope, but only on a matter of faith, an issue linked to his journey towards the happiness of the life to come, while taking full responsibility for his own project to provide guidance for his subjects on their journey towards happiness in this life. What's interesting here is that it's not only Agapetus who's presented here as doing God's work. For talking of his project to revise the laws, Justinian states very clearly that a Dio piacque di ispirarmi l'alto lavoro, that his work is inspired by God. The two ends of human life are not then one human and one divine, but are both, as the Monarchia says, given to us by ineffable providence. And this example of perfect collaboration between church and empire shows up all the more sharply the failure of those churchmen described in the Purgatorio's invective, who muddle the two ways and lead the whole of Italy astray with them. Their failure to recognise the dual ends of human life in the political order is as misguided as was Justinian's failure to recognise the dual nature of Christ. And their refusal to be guided in temporal matters by the authority of the emperor is in stark contrast to the way in which Justinian allows himself to be led to true faith, la fede sincera, by Agapetus. The notion that both Pope and Emperor have a divinely ordained mission to fulfill on earth comes out very clearly in Justinian's account of the history of Rome, which follows his introduction of himself and his own mission, and thereafter takes up much of this canto. Indeed, this seems precisely why Justinian feels he needs to tell this story, even though its details are well known, certainly to Dante Pilgrim, and almost certainly to Dante's first readers, as is signalled, as was pointed out in our discussion earlier, in the way that Justinian keeps repeating, as you know, tu sai, tu sai. The story of Rome is told here as the story of the eagle, Rome's sign and standard, as it moves from place to place, from east to west and then back again from west to east, and from one individual or group to another, from the city's earliest history to the time of the writing of the Commedia. But this eagle is precisely a divine sign. It's described in line 32 as a sacrosanto segno. And Justinian's is not so much a lesson in history as in salvation history. For this story is not merely an and then account of what the eagle did next, but builds to and falls away from a climactic moment, the moment when providential and temporal plans come together, when the divine Christ becomes also man. Thus, the passing of the imperial sign from the hands of the city's founders to the early kings and from the kings to the heroes of the Republican period is all presented by Justinian as mere preparation for the time when it would reach the hands of the emperors, under whom finally and uniquely the world would attain perfect peace, a peace willed both by God, Justinian tells us that this is something that tutto il ciel volle, and by Rome, per voler di Roma. The word pace, which falls at the very end of line 80 of this canto, marks the climax not only of the canto, but of history itself. For although Justinian does not make this explicit here, it is the peace achieved by Augustus which creates the conditions necessary for the birth of Christ, as Dante explains also in the Monarchia. The universal peace achieved under Augustus clearly opposes that universal lack of peace exemplified in contemporary Italy in the parallel passage of Purgatorio 6. But Dante also makes clear that the plenitudo temporis is a unique occurrence, that there never has been universal peace in all the world under a perfect world monarch, except at this moment, under Augustus. Everything that happens before this moment is just a preparation for it, and all that happens after it is a mere historical falling away. Moreover, Dante doesn't stop here, for Christ's mission on earth necessitated not only his birth, but also his death. For this reason, although Tiberius was a much less obviously positive imperial role model than Augustus, Dante gives him particular prominence here for his role in effecting the crucifixion, through which sins are forgiven and the way to heaven closed by the sin of Adam and Eve is reopened. Dante's praise of the person of Tiberius here may seem hyperbolic, but seen sub specie eternitatis, the importance of the judgment which he passes on Christ, which Tiberius passes on Christ, can scarcely be overstated. For if Christ is to take upon himself the sins of the whole world, then he must be punished justly, that is, by a legally constituted authority, one with authority over that whole world whose sins are being punished. Whilst the Convivio had given a more practical and perhaps more pragmatic reason why the empire needs to be universal in the here and now at the time when Dante is writing, that is, in order to centre all power and possessions in one person and therefore to destroy cupiditas, Paradiso 6 and the Monarchia present a more theological justification for the universal nature of the empire, at least in the 1st century AD. Worldwide imperial power is essential in order that the birth and death of Christ, in that human form which Justinian had initially denied, but whose necessity here he enthusiastically embraces, carry out its ordained function in salvation history. Returning to the Purgatorio then, it's a sign of the degree of the corruption that the poet sees around him in contemporary Italy, and of his increasing lack of hope for a resolution to the problem, that even the effectiveness of the crucifixion comes to be called into question. With a typically bold syncretist flourish, Dante turns to Christ directly, here addressing him as the Roman god Jupiter, and asking, "Son li giusti occhi tuoi rivolti altrove?" Has God, who so loved the world that he sent his own son to be crucified for its sake, Dante asks, now abandoned it entirely? This is surely a rhetorical question, and one to which the poet provides the answer in the next lines, reminding us of our limitations, those same human limitations which make it so hard for us to live in peace with one another, especially when proper guidance and leadership is lacking. For Christ's victory over death cannot have been in vain. Rather, the divine purpose behind Italy's political difficulties must simply be incomprehensible to those immediately caught up in them. Perhaps, indeed, the poet may well console himself, God already has the solution to this mess mapped out. In 1300, the fictional date of the pilgrim's journey through the three realms of the afterlife, no such potential solution immediately presents itself, however. German Albert is clearly no Augustus, and the poet here appears to hold out no greater hope for whoever may succeed him, wishing vindictive justice on the whole sorry dynasty. But in fact, nothing could be further from the way in which Dante would come to feel about Albert's successor at around the same time that he was writing the Purgatorio, when he wrote a series of impassioned letters addressed to the new emperor-elect. The subject matter of these letters, Florence, Italy, and the Empire, is so closely bound up with the subject matter of the three cantos under consideration here tonight, that I would like to spend a short time focusing on them and on the light which they cast not only on the invective of the Purgatorio, but also on the themes of the six cantos of both the Inferno and the Paradiso. The letters numbered 5, 6, and 7 in most editions of Dante's works, then, were all written between autumn 1310 and the end of April 1311, and all relate directly to the Italian campaign of the successor of Albert of Habsburg, Henry VII, Duke of Luxembourg. Henry had been chosen as King of the Romans and Emperor-elect in November 1308 and crowned by the Archbishop of Cologne in January 1309. Only a coronation in Rome, however, could confirm Henry's imperial authority. And so in autumn 1310 he set out for Italy, crossing the Alps on the 23rd of October. At this time Dante wrote to the princes and peoples of Italy, a kind of open letter, announcing Henry's arrival in Italy with undisguised joy and hope. This hope was to be short-lived, however. After an enthusiastic reception in Milan, Henry failed to proceed swiftly down the peninsula to ensure a timely coronation in Rome, and by the spring of 1311, when Dante wrote letters 6 and 7 addressed to the Florentines and to Henry himself respectively, his journey had stalled in the face of strong opposition from Florence and her allies, and of delaying tactics on the part of Pope Clement V. Henry died of malaria in 1313 without ever having conquered Florence or established his empire in Rome. These letters express with almost painful intensity Dante's hopes for a restoration of the great Roman Empire of the past in the figure of Henry, who's portrayed consistently as Italy's saviour, who will resolve all the political difficulties caused by the wars and factionalism that plague the peninsula, the very political difficulties against which Dante inveighs so vehemently in Purgatorio 6, and bring about a peace which will be like that only previously achieved under Augustus. Here then, far from imagining a Christ who turns his face away from an Italy in turmoil, Dante depicts an imperial Messiah, a bringer of peace, as can be seen from just one example, and there are others, some even more striking than this, taken from the opening paragraphs of the first of these missives. Here, the biblical references in support of Henry's messianic status come thick and fast. Dante announces the favourable time, as Paul had done in his second letter to the church at Corinth, immediately associating Henry's mission in Italy with that of Christ and his first followers on earth. There's an echo of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And of the Nunc Dimittis, Henry is the glory of Italy's people, as the Messiah was to be the glory of God's people, Israel. Henry's a second Moses, a Lion of Judah, a term used in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation to designate God's chosen one. And he's the bridegroom of the Song of Songs, a text which medieval exegesis took to refer to the mystical marriage of Christ with his church. It should already be clear, following our discussion of the Canto of Justinian, that Dante is here making utterly exceptional claims for Henry, in portraying him both as a new Augustus and as a second Christ. And the more Dante builds Henry up in this way, the more severely he judges those who, out of petty self-interest, would resist his divinely willed arrival on Italian soil. The language that Dante uses in the letter to the Florentines, for example, echoes very closely that of the invective of Purgatorio 6. When the throne of Augustus is vacant, the whole world goes awry. Just as we've seen in the Italy of 1300, not one single part of Italy enjoys peace. The captain and the oarsmen of the ship of St. Peter fall asleep, and wretched Italy is battered and buffeted by gales and floods. Just as in Purgatorio 6, Italy is equally wretched. The same word, misera, is used both in the Latin and the Italian texts. It's a ship without a pilot in a great storm, nave senza nocchiere in gran tempesta. And all this because the empire is vacant. The saddle of the horse of state, as we've seen, is riderless. In these letters, as in the cantos under consideration here tonight, the poet's strongest rebukes, however, are reserved for Florence, which is described in a passage of invective that I think surpasses anything in the Commedia, through a series of images which evoke the city's cunning, violence, and moral turpitude, piling one image on top of another in a relentless verbal onslaught. This passage, with its accumulation of animal images, the stinking vixen, the ill-omened beast, the viper, the sick sheep, and so on, recalls Dante's description of the monstrous Cerberus in Inferno 6, ruling over a circle of sinners, reduced by their greed to all that is most primitive and bestial in human nature. And among them, the pig-like glutton Chaco, whose name is wonderfully translated by Robin Kirkpatrick as Hoggo. In Purgatorio 2, the image of the wild beast recurs, as the horse that Justinian had once tamed is seen to have become fierce and cruel, untamed and wild, as it rampages riderless and out of control. And in the Paradiso, Justinian warns the Guelphs not to try to appropriate the imperial eagle for themselves if they wish to avoid being mauled by its great talons. And just as in the letter, Florence is compared to wicked women, the incestuous Myrrha and Amata, who in the Aeneid resists the divinely ordained foundation of Rome by opposing the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia, so too in the invective against Italy, both Italy and Florence are described through female parallels. Italy is non donna di provincia, ma bordello. And Florence, in her restlessness, the restlessness of relentless cupiditas, is like a sick crone, tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable on her bed. That is, never satisfied with what she has, but always seeking more power, more land, greater independence, and ever greater wealth, at the prompting of that gloria d'acquistare described in the Convivio. And Rome, too, in the invective, is described through a female image, widowed and alone, vedova e sola, crying out for the emperor who's abandoned her. The image here is a biblical one, recalling the famous opening verse of the Book of Lamentations, how deserted lies the city once so full of people, how like a widow she is, who once was great among the nations. Rome, the city which should be the heart and the head of the empire, now, as it had been under Augustus, has become a second Jerusalem, but a Jerusalem which is not the promised land envisaged in the letter to the princes and peoples of Italy, but, like the city of Lamentations, a Jerusalem in ruins with its temple destroyed. Once again here, the tone echoes that of Dante's letters, for this same passage from the Book of Lamentations is quoted directly by Dante at the beginning of his 11th letter, which was written in 1314, following the death of Pope Clement V, and addressed to the Italian cardinals in conclave at Carpentras. Here, Dante claims that Clement's death, following close on the death of Henry in the previous year, has left Rome destitute and widowed, deprived of both the church, which has been in exile in Avignon since 1309, and the empire. And in fact, this passage from Lamentations seems to have been a particular favourite of Dante's. Notice how it's also evoked at the beginning of the invective of Purgatorio 6 in the phrase non donna di provincia, for it features also as early in his career as the Vita Nuova, where it's used to describe the lonely widowed Florence deprived by death of Beatrice. Through the simple but emblematic phrase vedova e sola, Dante then is able to set up here a complex series of cross-references which look both forwards and backwards in time. The Rome of 1300, the time of the journey through Purgatory, is widowed and alone because her emperor, German Albert, ignores and abandons her. But this Rome of 1300 also looks forward to the Rome of the second decade of the 14th century, the time of writing of the Purgatorio. This Rome has waited so long for its Cesare to arrive, in the form now of Henry rather than Albert, only for him to prove ineffectual in standing up to the papacy and unable to conquer Florence, and for his imperial mission to be cut short by his premature death. It has, in the meantime, also lost the papacy. And both these widowed Romes look back to the widowed city of Florence, deprived not of her political guides, but of her guide to heaven, literally her Beatrice. And it's to heaven, appropriately enough, that we should turn in conclusion. I began by saying that the Ai serva Italia passage in Purgatorio 6 could be read as a sort of gloss on the relationship between Dante Pilgrim's otherworldly journey and the poet's political journey through the selva oscura of our life on earth. This invective is clearly anticipated in Canto 6 of Inferno, but with a much narrower focus, of course, by Ciacco's account of the wickedness of Florence, the starting point of the pilgrim's journey, and a city where even the noblest and best citizens are consigned to deepest hell. As the pilgrim proceeds on his journey through the afterlife, his focus widens and his understanding deepens, just as in real life, as it were, political events move on. And Dante breaks away from the white Guelphs exiled with him in 1301 and begins to write and think much more like that parte per se stesso, that party of one, that his ancestor Cacciaguida will tell him to form when they meet in the heaven of Mars. Henry succeeds Albert, and Dante embraces the aims of his Italian campaign with an enthusiasm that almost reads like a parody of political fervour, until Henry fails, leaving Rome widowed once more. I believe that in the wake of Henry's death, Dante dramatically reassesses his conception of the political order, and specifically his belief in the possibility of the establishment of a universal Roman Empire on earth. In the Paradiso, then, and most notably in Justinian's thoroughly providential, Christ-centred account of Roman history, conveyed so aptly in Giovanni di Paolo's illustration, we see, I believe, a story with a beginning, Aeneas' flight from Troy, a middle, the incarnation and crucifixion, the providential moments on which the whole story hangs, and an end, Dante's here and now, a time when no new emperor could make of Italy a land of milk and honey, and no new Christ could bring about Italy's political redemption. Just as I believe that the Monarchia only makes sense when read not as a practical political manual, as it were a blueprint for world domination. It's kind of build your own empire in 3 easy stages. But as a utopian meditation on what might have been, and a reflection on what, between 1310 and 1313, had gone so badly wrong. So too, it seems to me, in Paradiso 6, we find, yes, a description of that perfect empire of which Dante dreams, but no sense that it can now ever be reconstructed on earth. In the 3 cantos which I've explored tonight, then, we have travelled, to take a piece of text which is very dear to me, even if it doesn't come from one of the cantos I've been asked to talk about tonight, we've travelled di Fiorenza in popolo giusto e sano. We've travelled from Florence to a nation just and true, to heaven. And this is important because while I believe that Henry's death occasioned in Dante a deep political pessimism, I do not believe that he gave up altogether on the notion of community. Rather, he shifted his ideal community upwards, heavenwards, to that realm where all the souls want only what God wants, and where, therefore, cupiditas and the libido dominandi have no place. Thank you.